All around the globe, societies have collapsed. Medical facilities were overwhelmed to a breaking point. Labor shortages caused those fortunate enough to have access to running water, electricity, fresh food, to suddenly know what it means to live without. As the bodies piled up, the piles quickly grew out of control. Military efforts were a last resort, and they too reached a breaking point. Suddenly, one apocalypse wasn't enough, and humanity, in all its progress, made sure it would make no more. So, how did we get here? The bombs are one thing, perhaps another time. So how did we get here? Perhaps it would be better put as, how did they get here? The answers aren't all there for us to find in-game, but we have enough material to build a framework. So today, let's take a closer look at the zombie virus itself. Welcome to episode 15 of the Untold Stories of Navezgane. In this series, we're going to explore and dissect the most interesting places and concepts in the default setting of 7 Days to Die. From mountaintop mansions to fortified factories to the zombie virus itself, we're going to learn the stories of those who didn't make it. I'm gonna go ahead and begin this episode right off the bat with something that comes up very frequently in the comment sections of the Stories of Navezgane videos. Yes, we can say with a fair amount of certainty that the zombie disease is in fact a virus, as opposed to bacteria. To be clear, we can surmise this from the headlines we can find on newspapers scattered about Navezgane. This is the relevant paper. The Daily News reports on a flu epidemic, probably sweeping across the nation, if not the globe. Now, this could be unrelated to the zombies, but given the image on the front page depicting a very green-looking man, I'm gonna go ahead and say it's not. So we have a sort of direct correlation between this flu and the zombies. The flu is in fact a virus, influenza to be specific. Now there are many types and subtypes and groups and subgroups of the influenza virus, so it's actually not all that crazy to imagine that the virus that caused the zombieism we see in Navezgane would be identified as a flu, a new variant. But I can hear you typing. When you become infected in-game, you use antibiotics to cure the disease. They wouldn't help if it were a virus. And you're correct. If what you were treating with those antibiotics was the zombie virus, they wouldn't do much for you. But the reason they work is because it isn't the zombie virus you're treating. You see, in-game, when you develop an infection, it'll usually come from being hit by a zombie or zombie-like creature. But this isn't the only way you can develop an infection. The infection you might incur in-game is actually a bacterial infection, like you might develop in any open wound. This is why antibiotics remedy the symptoms. Now that that bit of housekeeping is out of the way, taking these things into consideration, it's actually quite likely that the player character has some sort of natural immunity or at least resistance to the zombie flu, and this isn't at all a far-fetched idea. Most people actually have a natural defense for every possible virus we may encounter now or ever, thanks to T cells and B cells and a whole bunch of other complicated stuff, but sometimes the virus can still win, especially if it's a particularly deadly one. If you'd like to learn a bit more about how the human body fights viruses and bacteria and the like, I highly recommend this Kurzgesagt video. A card is appearing in the top right corner of your screen too. It'll help you visualize a bit what I'm getting at here. So we're only 3.5 minutes into this video and we've successfully established that the disease is in fact a virus. Great. But what else can we surmise about the virus? How did it spread all across the world? Why is it so incredibly efficient and, frankly, good at what it does? And how does it do what it does? Let's get weird sciencey. Based on these images we can find in Higashi, Dishang, and other locations containing medical facilities, it seems the virus is doing something to the brain. That isn't too shocking, but what exactly could it be doing? Well, as I've stated in previous videos, I'm no neurologist, surprisingly, but these images may be showing activity around the precentral gyrus, the part of your brain that controls voluntary motion. Being that's the only area that's showing significant activity, it seems safe to say that the undead are in fact quite dead. Sort of. I mean, their brains are still doing something, so are they? Let me introduce you, or perhaps reacquaint you with Ophiucordyceps unilateralis. You might have heard of it. If not, prepare yourself for quite a trip. Ophiucordyceps unilateralis, or the zombie ant fungus as it's more commonly known, probably because the former is a goddamn mouthful. is a type of fungus that enters the bodies of ants, usually as a few single cells, begins reproducing, and then begins, in a sense, forming a system of tubes that connect individual cells to each other in order to share nutrients and, in a sense, communicate. When this fungus successfully infects an ant, it grows rather rapidly, siphoning off nutrients from its host. Eventually, it forces the ant to climb a plant stem near its nest. It stops the ant at around 25 centimeters, usually a place with the perfect temperature and humidity for the fungus itself to grow, and it forces the ant to lock its terrible little mandibles around a leaf or some part of the stem to lock it in place. An involuntary but self-locked handcuff. Or face cuff. Ugh. Eventually, the fungus, sprouts from the ant's head and begins raining spores down on the rest of the ants below, spreading the zombieism. Perhaps most impressively, the fungus usually doesn't even touch the brain when it does this. It directly takes over the muscles of the ant. Eventually, the neurons in the ant's brain that give it control over its own muscles just die. The ant is at least sort of still alive. Its brain, according to Ed Yong, reporter for The Atlantic, is still in the driver's seat. But the fungus has the wheel. Whether or not this is also the case in the zombies of 7 Days to Die, hard to say. Perhaps we'll come back to that another time. But this isn't science fiction. This isn't the setup for some video game. This fungus is real. So, in real life, we have a real example of a fungus that pretty stereotypically zombifies a living creature and intentionally, intelligently perhaps, spreads itself to others. But fungi are relatively complex organisms, the most complex compared to viruses and bacteria, actually. In fact, viruses are the least complex of the three. Scientists debate whether viruses can even be considered alive. They're mostly just genetic material encased in protein. So how could a virus accomplish such a sophisticated takeover? To start with, it infects both people and various animals, which is quite rare. According to most estimates, there are anywhere between 260,000 and 1.6 million viruses that to some degree affect animals in nature. Of those, only about 219 of them have ever been known to infect humans. That's sort of as much a quirk of how viruses work as it is a feat of the human immune system, but anyway, that means anywhere between 0.014 and 0.08% of viruses have ever been known to infect humans. Let me reiterate, far less than 1% of all viruses we know of infect humans. And here we have a virus that we can observe infecting humans, birds, dogs, bears, and who knows what else. And being zoonotic, being able to successfully transfer from animals to humans, will certainly help with the already quite clearly rapid spread of this virus. Nextly, on the topic of that rapid spread, there's clearly a pretty major cause for concern. There are two big environmental clues we can find in Navezgane that suggest the zombie virus spreads rapidly, probably via airborne transmission, physical contact, etc. The first clue is that, pretty much everyone is infected. But the second clue is the hazmat-suited zombies. There seems to be a lot of them. Likely towards the beginning of the end, the United States government dispatched all available resources to fight the virus, in multiple senses. This is nothing new. The military can and has been used to facilitate the administration of vaccines, keep the peace in times of turmoil, and would probably be some of the first in, other than local law enforcement, if there were hordes of zombies to gun down. This is all to say, there's plenty of plausible reason for these hazmats to be wandering about, and there's more we can learn from them. There are 4 levels of hazmat suits, A through D. D, being the lowest, is pretty much equivalent to what you'd expect somebody on a construction site to be wearing. Sometimes coveralls, a hard hat, maybe some eye protection and gloves, nothing too serious. Level C hazmat is probably a little bit closer to what most people picture in their heads when they hear the word hazmat. A basic respirator, a full-body suit, airtight seal at the ankles, that sort of thing. It's possible the hazmat suits we see in Navezgane are in fact level C, but I'd wager they're actually level B, given the dial on their chest, which to me would indicate a closed breathing system of some kind. Now, many of us have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that in many cases, a simple N95 mask and basic precautions are enough to drastically improve your odds of avoiding a contagious virus. Sure, a full hazmat suit would be better, but usually hardly necessary. The fact that there are so many of these high-level hazmat suits meandering about says something terrifying about the sheer contagiousness of the zombie disease. The fact that they're still being worn by the undead says something even more horrifying. Even this wasn't enough. Granted, the models in-game appear to have compromised masks. Perhaps they were mostly taken down by the already undead as opposed to the virus getting them otherwise. Either way, it's safe to say the transmission levels of this virus were unlike anything we've ever seen. And finally, we have perhaps the most unique and effective method by which the zombie virus in 7 Days to Die propagates itself. Undeath. Much like the zombie ant fungus, it seems the zombie virus in Navezgane has its own method of ensuring its spread. When an infected individual passes away, they return, in a sense. Or at least physically, the zombie virus forces them to begin moving again. And what do we observe them doing? What seems to be their only goal? Killing. Specifically, killing uninfected humans. Us. It's likely that this has always been the strategy of the virus, and it's a pretty good one. Infect a host, let that host spread you around for a while before you, mostly, kill that host. Then, take over its, hopefully by now, lifeless corpse, and use its decaying tissue to physically attack anyone who isn't infected, likely spreading the virus upon contact, and a new self-perpetuating host is unborn. Unlike the aforementioned fungus, the virus very specifically attacks the part of the brain in control of voluntary motion, ensuring its host has no choice in any of these matters. Or perhaps that's the only part of the brain it needs to control. Another scary thing about this virus, because it's so incredibly transmissible, you'd never have to see a single zombie to succumb to it. A handshake, a hug, a simple brushing by an infected individual, or animal for that matter, possibly weeks before the world began to end, you could be the world's most impressive prepper, isolate yourself in an underground bunker with weapons and food and water and all the entertainment you'd need. It wouldn't matter. It's already got you. You would die in that bunker alone. And you'd still turn. And then, because you've locked yourself up all alone, the virus doesn't have anyone to try to spread to, so you'd probably just sit there. Forever. There's actually plenty of evidence for this in Navezgane, though there aren't too many perfectly airtight examples. We can find plenty of former people locked and sealed away, hidden from any and all zombies, but they've turned. So we've answered one how, but there's another. We know how the virus was so astonishingly successful in replacing most of the human population of the planet, but how, then, did this virus come to be? I've seen some speculation that the evidence of meteorites we can find in Navezgane suggest an alien virus, one that abruptly crashed into Earth in droves and seeped out into unready human bodies before we had time to combat it. But in a previous video, I think I pretty certainly explained that as astronomically unlikely. But anyway, I suppose it's technically possible that such a sophisticated virus could exist, but honestly, for that to happen, it would probably take years upon years, decades even, after human discovery, for a simple virus to mutate into such a well-oiled machine. I'd think by then, humanity would have found a better way to combat it, or at least there would be signs that the struggle against the ultimate virus was taking place. But perhaps there are signs. Literally, signs. This narrative would explain all of the death-themed businesses and city names. That could be the case. Or the story we've cobbled together thus far in this series still makes sense. The secret underground labs, the shady narco-style hideouts, the good versus evil themes, the suspicious facilities in Higashi. It might be too much to just cast aside. If you're new to the channel or this series, I'm probably sounding pretty crazy right now. I'd highly recommend going back and watching the rest of the stories of Navezgane, and then I promise this will almost make sense. But in the meantime, what do you think? Was this ultra-virus produced in a lab by Higashi as part of some master plan of the Dukes? Or was this a slow trickle of undeath that eventually entered the zeitgeist of society before wiping those very societies out entirely? Perhaps sometime in the future we'll have the opportunity to find out. Or we'll be left with what we have, any number of answers equally plausible. I guess we'll have to wait and see. So until then, and until next time, thanks for watching.